Steven. So let's dive in. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music's free, virtual, and totally informal monthly series, Conversations with Our Curator. I am the curator, Melissa Ziobro, and a history professor at Monmouth University in beautiful West Long Branch, New Jersey. And tonight we are chatting with Steven Hyden about his new book, There Was Nothing You Could Do, Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA and the End of the Heartland. It just came out in May of this year. I cannot tell you, I was just like fangirling because this book is so well researched and so well written and so thought-provoking and just funny, like laugh out loud funny at times. It is such a tremendous read. Like it's not often that you read Bob Dylan and DILF in the same sentence. You just don't see it, right? So amazing. This you have to get it after we wrap up here tonight. But before we dive into chatting with Steven, just a few housekeeping details. We always have new people popping up on these Zooms, and this is my opportunity to spread the gospel of the Bruce Springsteen Archives with all of you. So if you'll bear with me for a moment, as I said, we are located on the campus of Monmouth University, which is in Central Jersey. We are just a mile from the beach and just up the road from famed Asbury Park. We preserve the legacy of Bruce Springsteen. We are his official repository. And we also celebrate the diversity of American music across history in all of its genres, all of its artists, all of its forms with our exhibits and our programming. As a public historian and an educator, I just really firmly believe that music is one of the most accessible ways to access the past, right? And learning history is critical to being like the best informed citizen in our democracy, right? And so this work that we're doing, I hope you'll agree, is not only fun, it's really important. So anyway, off my soapbox, we at the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music are in the midst of planning for a brand new 30,000 square foot museum building, which is scheduled to open on our campus in the spring of 2026. We broke ground recently. There's actually a hole in the ground there. So it's very, very exciting. It's really happening now. That new building will have a roughly 250 seat theater, a small gift shop, and then 2 floors of exhibits. From indigenous music history to, the span of 250 years of American music history to, of course, Bruce and the E Street Band. And then we'll retain our archives, which will be available for researchers. So if you were not familiar with us before this evening, I'm going to drop our link tree in the chat, and I hope you will check us out on either our website, springsteenarchives.org, or our socials. So thank you for giving me, those few minutes to introduce us a little bit to you. Back to tonight's program specifically, Conversations with Our Curator is this, as I said, free virtual series that features writers and researchers who are exploring new perspectives in American music history. It's often about Bruce, though not always, right? We did, who did we do recently? Janis Joplin and Dolly Parton, right? With the amazing Holly George Warren, because we are the Center for American Music, in addition to the Springsteen Archives. So we'll start with me asking a few questions of Steven. And then the best part is we get to move into your questions. So whether you have read this amazing book yet or not, this will be your opportunity to converse with Steven on your own. So what else? I think that's it. I like to keep these to an hour. We like to keep it snappy. So we'll break around 8 o'clock. Anyone in the class have any questions for me before we... We're good? Okay, awesome. So Steven Hyden is the author of Twilight of the Gods and Your Favorite Band is Killing Me, among many other things. His writing has appeared in New York Times Magazine, Washington Post, Billboard, Pitchfork, Rolling Stone, the AV Club, and on and on and on. Steve, you said that Bruce has come up in some of your books before, right? But you were drawn to write about Born in the USA specifically. It was only in part because it was the 40th anniversary year, though. So tell us a little bit more about what compelled you to write this book.
Well, I just want to say I'm thrilled to be here, and this looks so great. I want to come to this museum. I think it's going to be an incredible facility. It just looks great, and I'm honored by all the nice things you said about me before you brought me out here. Um, why did I want to write about Born in the USA? Well, there's a couple reasons. One, this is one of the first records, not just Bruce Springsteen records, but like records period that made an impression on me as a kid. Like I was 6 years old in the summer of '84 when this record dropped. So it's been the album really in my life that I've loved as long as like any other record. It's really grown up with me from the time I was a kid. So that was a big reason why I wanted to write about it. I mean, I feel like I've been researching this in a weird way for 40 years, from the time I was in, kindergarten. So there was that. The other thing too, it's interesting with Born in the USA because it's obviously the most popular record that Bruce ever put out, but in a way, I feel like it's a little under discussed. It's very easy to see things about Nebraska. People love to talk about that record, or Born to Run, or Darkness on the Edge of Town, or The River. But Born in the USA is a record that, at least from my perspective, hasn't been talked about as much. And I feel like, it's such a rich text, I think, in a lot of ways, where you can talk about the record, but there's a lot of other tangents that you can go from talking about that album. Like in the book, I talk a lot about how rock music has changed in the last 40 years and how like America has changed in the last 40 years. It just seemed like an album where there's a lot on the record itself, and there's also like a lot in the subtext of the record that I think is really interesting, that attracted me. Like I knew that it would be very easy for me to like write a lot about this album. So those would be the things I think that attracted me to this record in particular.
Which you said is not necessarily your favorite Springsteen
Yes. Yeah, I
record,
mean, it's probably like Born to Run or Darkness on the Edge of Town, you know, uh, but I think this is the album that I would most want to write about. I mean, that's why I wrote the book, obviously. But I just think that there's so much in the text of the record, and also, again, as I said, like in the subtext of it, that this is an album that, this was Bruce going into the mainstream of America, and it's the record where he really became this iconic figure. If we look beyond just sort of the fandom of Bruce, and we look at Bruce in the popular consciousness, if you were to ask the average person on the street, what comes to mind when you mention Bruce Springsteen? They're going to describe a lot of the things that we associate with like the Born in the USA Bruce, the American flag, the famous album cover, the uh, muscular guy on stage, like with the cut off sleeves, with the bandana. That's still such an iconic image that resonates in culture 40 years later. That's how I think embedded in popular culture that record is. And it's funny because I think with Bruce fans, in a way, they feel like this album like doesn't belong to them. Like this is the album that belongs to everybody. And it's not like Darkness on the Edge of Town, for instance, where if you're a hardcore Bruce fan, like that's a record that you can kind of take into your heart and feel like this belongs to us. It feels a little more personal. Whereas Born in the USA is such a broad record in a lot of ways that I think, I don't know. again, from my perspective, I just felt like it wasn't being discussed as much in a way. So I felt like there was a lane for me to write about it. I mean, there's so many Bruce books. I mean, that's the daunting thing about, venturing into this lane. There's so many Bruce books. There's so many great Bruce books, and it's like, what are you going to contribute that's unique? So I felt like, well, I can write this book that is from a perspective of a kid who heard it when he was really young, and I can make it kind of funny, but there's also like a lot of heartfelt stuff in the book as well. And that's going to make it maybe a little bit different, and it's going to make it worth reading for people that care about this great American artist.
Mm. You mentioned the abundance that the Bruce historiography is deep there. And it's
Right.
literally my job. I literally get paid to read it all. That's my job. But you did. I mean, you reached new depths here. It's just masterful.
Oh,
Um,
thank you.
your title, There Was Nothing You Could Do, draws upon a lyric not from the album's title track, but from My Hometown. Can you tell us a little bit
Right.
how that lyric ties into your thesis or your overarching goals for the book?
Yeah, I mean, My Hometown is my favorite song on the record. So I think it started with that. And it kind of starts with just loving that line and feeling like that would be a good title. It's very evocative. So it starts with that. But I think it really ties into the idea of this record being a big tent album that comes out in 1984, and it feels like an album. It feels like an album that like just welcomes people in, and it's the kind of rock record that really, frankly, doesn't exist in 2024.
Mm,
Um, there are other kinds of records in 2024 that are Big Tent records, but certainly like not rock records, and certainly not records made by someone like Bruce Springsteen.
mm,
And drawing upon that and talking about America, sort of the idea of America that I think exists in Bruce Springsteen songs, which is, no matter what our differences are, there are sort of certain underpinning ideas that unite us as Americans, and that if we can get beyond sort of the distractions that exist in the world, whether, it's from the media or it's from politicians, these sort of core ideals that make us Americans, if we can get back to that, then that is something that is worth pursuing. And I think that's something that's, Bruce Springsteen has talked about. Bruce obviously comes from a certain political persuasion. He's always been, very outspoken about that. But I think he does believe in sort of a united America. And
mm,
um, I think in the book, like I'm in sort of dealing with my own feelings about that, because I think listening to Bruce Springsteen from such a young age, it really embedded that into my heart. Like I feel like Bruce was among the people, maybe the foremost person that kind of taught me about like the idea of America at its best, like what America should be, and how in the modern age we consistently fall short of that. And we fall short of it to a degree where it feels like it's almost impossible now to live up to that kind of idea. So that's something I think that I was trying to explore in the book, the idealism of Bruce Springsteen, and how, like whether you can actually still believe in that maybe in 2024. So I think the title is alluding to that, because I think Bruce himself constantly is wrestling with that in his music, because he is like, I think at heart he is a patriot, but he's also someone who is aware and is writing about the shortcomings of America and how we fall short of what we need to be. And but he never gives up hope. He still believes that we can get there. And but like as a Bruce Springsteen fan in 2024, you know, is it still possible to have that hope? And I don't know the answer to that, but it's something I wrestle with. And I think it's something that a lot of people wrestle with.
I will, at the drop of a hat, deliver a verbal thesis on Bruce's patriotism. So I will contain myself here, though, but it happens often on campus. I mean, there's this great Mark Twain quote, right? That's like patriotism is supporting your country all the time and your government when it deserves it. And I think that's
Right.
the type of patriotism we're talking about here, right? There's a quote, I'm going to jump ahead. This is actually going to be my last question, but we're kind of going down this road. Um, this was so impactful to me towards the end of the book, and you write about how, as you just said, you hear the album for the first time in your dad's car at 6 years old, and you say, in the view of America I was brought up to put my faith in, there really is a single solitary heartland. It is a land where Americans, if they are not distracted by demagogues or culture wars or the media, are drawn together by their common human needs for community, dignity, health, safety, and security. And these impulses are carrying us slowly, though not always directly, toward a state of harmony and justice. But there's another view. In this America, there is no heartland. Americans have the potential to come together over common wants and needs, but that's only one option. There's also the option of attacking one another if this is seen as preferable or merely an easier way to survive. And you conclude, I want to live in the America that I discovered and born in the USA, but these days it feels like an awfully lonely place.
Yeah, that's it.
I mean, the book comes out in the 40th anniversary year of Born in the USA, but we're also in this very stark political time, right?
Right.
How much did you intend for the book to be inherently political, or?
I mean, there's definitely a political element to the book. I mean, I'm a music critic, so I'm primarily concerned with music and also just writing an entertaining book for people. But again, I mean, I think with Bruce, like with this record, and again, like we don't, I think this audience all is familiar with the idea or, the story of this album being misinterpreted by people on the right, using it as a sort of political tool, like a jingoistic, misinterpreting the title song as a jingoistic song, and how that just totally misreads the sort of intent that Bruce is coming from. Um, I but I do think like if you read Bruce Springsteen interviews and just I, if you go to Bruce Springsteen shows, I think he is inherently like a unifying figure, but it's also unifying people on a certain set of ideals that it feels like we're getting farther away from.
Mm.
So like I'm not like a political writer or anything, but I feel like to write about this record and not try to reckon with that would have been malpractice. I mean, that's obviously a big part of the album and what it represents. Um, but again, yeah, like I wrote in the book that part you just read, um, I feel like with I feel Bruce embedded a certain idealism in me about like what America can be. And like when we talk about patriotism, like the word patriot is so sort of um perverted, I guess, by a lot of people. It's turned into this sort of, again, sort of jingoistic, simple-minded thing. To me, with Bruce, like the Bruce Springsteen patriotism is the patriotism of inclusion and elevation of what the ideals of like what this country was built on, and like us sort of aspiring to like a higher level of uh sort of citizenship. And that's something that I feel like I got from his music. And when you look at America now, it doesn't seem to fit that idealism that I got from his music. And it doesn't mean you have to abandon that idealism, but I think for all of us, I think this is probably a common thing. It's always a struggle to hold on to that in the face of so much sort of discouraging evidence to the contrary. And I try not to come to a conclusion at the end because I think this is an evolving sort of struggle, and but uh thank goodness we can go to Bruce Springsteen concerts and feel
Mm.
like for 3 hours we're part of a community, and hopefully we can carry that community forward when we leave the show. And I think it's like in the last chapter I write about, seeing Bruce on this current tour and, you know, wanting to feel like I can carry that forward, even if it feels hard to do.
In the conclusion of your book, you cite the kind of shtick he does with Steve, where it's, I don't want to go home. I don't want to go home. Right. And you say you don't want to go home
Yeah.
because you want to stay in that place where you can be in community. Right. And you have
Right.
those good vibes. And that featured prominently in Road Diaries, which I got
Yeah.
last night, and everybody's got to watch when it comes out. But
It's a
that
big, yeah, it's
exact,
a big part of that movie. And it's a big
yeah.
part of that tour, I feel
Yeah.
like. Yeah, for sure.
I'm going to ask one more kind of deeper question, then I got a little lighter ones. But while we're on this topic, you noted, as I'm sure most of the audience knows, that Born in the USA so often gets misinterpreted. You write about how it's both a protest song and a celebration of American identity. In 1984, you could be those two things at once. But today, you say you really can't. You need two songs now to do the job of one for each side, is how you put it. Can you comment on that a little bit for us?
Yeah, Born in the USA, like part of the greatness of that song, in my opinion, is how you have these lyrics that are so it's such a literary lyric and it's so embittered and so angry. But you also have this music that is really, I think it's like the most anthemic music of Springsteen's career. And I'm not the first person to say this, but that combination of elements is, in a way, the song's curse because it obscured, I think, what Springsteen was trying to communicate lyrically. But I guess the case I'm trying to make is that I think it's also part of the song's greatness because it's a song that communicates two seemingly contradictory ideas that America, on one hand, is a place where if you serve your country, you can come back home and people can reject you, and you feel like you're not part of a community anymore, and you're totally alienated. And at the same time, the music, if you play that music in a stadium, like it unites tens of thousands of strangers, like people that have nothing in common, maybe otherwise, other than loving this music. So it's like the best of America and the worst of America in the same package. And I think that was the point I was trying to convey in in the book. And to me that's really the power of the song. Because Bruce has played that song obviously in a much more sort of straightforward protest song manner. Like when he plays that song acoustically, for instance, he really downplays the anthemic aspects of it, and it's like this bluesy dirge type song, and it's like there's no way you can miss the point of the lyrics. And that's a great version too. But to me, to be able to convey these two ideas simultaneously is a much more sort of sophisticated thing. And it's complicated because I think with Bruce, with this record, and that song maybe in particular, but this album generally, I think, I mean, it's my impression, and this is based on interviews that he's done over the years, but I think he has a lot of ambivalence about this record because of the way it entered the mainstream of popular culture. And when you enter the mainstream popular culture, you don't have control really of the message anymore. If you're playing in front of like 100,000 people, they're not all going to take the message from it that you want them to take. Some people are going to be there for like the wrong reasons, maybe. And for someone like Bruce Springsteen, who, I think can charitably be described as a control freak, like I think he wants to be in control of like how he's presented in his music. I mean, he's fought very hard for that over the years. I mean, I'm sure that was very difficult for him to feel like, okay, I'm achieving the success that the Beatles and Elvis had, all my heroes, but like, are the people in the audience getting what I'm saying? I'm sure that was very difficult for him um, to reckon with. And I think that's another sort of interesting layer about this record, that it wasn't just Bruce fans loving him. It was just regular people outside of that. Um, so um, yeah, I don't know. The complexity of that song, I think, is so fascinating. And I think it really kind of makes it like one of the great Bruce Springsteen songs. And you don't have to just kind of fall on one side or the other. I think people feel like they have to turn that song into a binary, but I don't think you do. I think it's more interesting when you leave the complexity in there. That's a very long and rambling answer to that, but
I love long
I
and
did
rambling
write
answers.
80,000 words about this album, so I've got a
Oh,
lot to say
no,
about it
that
anyway.
was great. I am going to switch gears a little bit because I want to give the audience a taste of how wide ranging this book is. I was very surprised at how much ground you covered because it's not focused just on this album. I mean, you go back to talk about Bruce's early influences, and then, as we noted, you go all the way through recent touring. So it's not this kind of myopic focus on Born in the USA. So early in the book, you are talking about Bruce as a quote updated hybrid of Elvis and Dylan, which I don't think is necessarily shocking to anyone. But then you go into what I think is the most thoughtful discussion of the Elvis, Dylan, Bruce, you know, dynamics I have ever read. You conclude that section of the book by noting that Bruce would, quote, apply Dylan's self preserving example to save himself from Elvis's fate.
Yeah.
Can you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the fascinating, oh, I mean, look, there's many fascinating aspects about Bruce, but like, I think with Bruce and stardom, his relationship to that, I think is very sort of uh, you know, embracing it and then backing away. And you can see that, I think, in the build up to Born in the USA, like where he makes Born to Run, this record that, like, famously puts him on the cover of Newsweek and Time. There's tons of hype about it. And then he makes Darkness on the Edge of Town, which is a very sort of anti-commercial record. And there's no single, it's like, I'm not going to like promote this record. I'm not going to do interviews for it. It doesn't have any, it doesn't sound anything like the previous record. It's very angry. Um, it's not very pop friendly at all. And, we all know the story about, the backstory of Darkness on the Edge of Town, like where he wrote all of these songs uh, that could have been on the record that were very poppy and very in the style of Born to Run, but he consciously chose not to put those out until many years later on the Darkness on the Edge of Town box set. And then he does The River, of course, and then Hungry Heart is a big hit single from that. And then he does Nebraska, again, another very just sort of anti-pop record. And then, of course, Born in the USA, this album that has like, 7 top 10 singles, just a juggernaut. And then he does Tunnel of Love after that, which is, this downscale, very adult sounding record and doesn't really feel like it's part of pop music at all in 1987 when it comes out. So, yeah, I think there is sort of a Dylan-esque thing with him combined with the Elvis thing. You got the Elvis impulse, which is to embrace the public and to be the big rock star. But then you have the Dylan thing at the same time, which is more of a mercurial, I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to defy the public's expectations of me. And it's really interesting to see how that works in tandem with Bruce. You feel that in him going back and forth. And again, like as I was saying about Born in the USA, I mean, if you read, you know, Born to Run, his memoir, or, you know, songs like that book of lyrics that he put out in the late 90s, he's very ambivalent about Born in the USA. I mean, he talks openly about feeling like I went deep into the pop world. Maybe I went too deep with this album. But he also had that impulse to make that record, you know, to be like Elvis, to be like the Beatles. And it clearly made like he wanted to be someone that wasn't just a cult favorite, but that you could hear his songs on the radio and that he would make an impact with just regular people. And clearly, I mean, I'm one of those people. Like, I was a 6-year-old kid when Born in the USA
Mhm.
came out. I wasn't listening to Darkness on the Edge of Town in kindergarten. Like, I wouldn't have known about Bruce if he hadn't put out Dancing in the Dark. Like, I'm part of that generation that he reached, you know, like little kids listening to him because of this record. So, like, I'm grateful that he did that. And I think you need artists to do that, artists of Bruce Springsteen's caliber, great artists who also feel like I want to reach little kids and plant a seed in their brain that's going to sprout and lead them to other things. So I look at myself as like evidence that he was right to go down that path with this record. Because
Mhm.
I mean, I probably would have found him eventually, but you know, maybe not. You know, I'm grateful that I heard Bruce Springsteen at such a young age, you know, because he was all over MTV at that time. It was a very beneficial thing for me personally that he did that.
I'm right there with you. And I think my mom is on the call here. So, mom listening to Bruce, getting ready for family parties and cleaning the house. And that's, you're fed it from an early age. And here we are. I'm going to put my questions on ice so that I can start to ask the questions from the chat because I always want to prioritize our guests as much as possible. I will start to read some of the questions from the chat. When I run out of those, I will offer you the opportunity to unmute yourself and ask a question. Okay. So here's one from Julie. This question may be unanswerable, but why did Bruce write Born in the USA when he did? Like, why specifically then?
Well, I read about this a bit in the book. I mean, you know, there's the story about Bruce reading Ron Kovic's book, Born on the Fourth of July, and how that was really the beginning of him starting to be engaged, like with the Vietnam veteran community. And that led him to doing the famous show in Los Angeles in 1981, the benefit show for Vietnam veterans. And I think that was the beginning of him sort of thinking about that. I mean, I feel like Vietnam is also, I mean, it's not explicitly mentioned on Darkness on the Edge of Town, but, and I read about this in the book. I mean, I feel like Darkness in a lot of ways is like, you know, if you look at the films that were coming out in the late 70s, you know, like movies like Taxi Driver, you know, or Rolling Thunder, or obviously Apocalypse Now, that were coming out that were really starting to deal with Vietnam at that time. In a way, I feel like Darkness is like the musical equivalent of those albums. And just the idea of what that meant to the country and the sort of psychic damage of that conflict. And again, it's like not like a literal part of that record, but I think there is sort of like a metaphorical thing going on. I think with
Mm-hmm.
Bruce, because he was writing about these like working class people in New Jersey, and obviously Bruce was also affected by Vietnam as a younger man. He almost got drafted. He knew people that had gone to Vietnam, and was a member of the Castiles that went to Vietnam and passed away over there. So I think that was on his brain. But yeah, I think it really starts with him reading Ron Kovic's book, and that just becoming a big part of his consciousness and his activism. I mean, that really kind of feels like in a way that like the spark that made him more politically motivated? Because like Bruce as a young man, like was not he wasn't really political. I mean, he's he did interviews where he talked about like how, he wasn't really even a voter as a young man, and he wasn't really even thinking about that. I think he was just busy being on the road. But it feels like the Vietnam conflict and Vietnam veterans in America was the beginning of that, and I think that leads to Born in the USA.
We actually have Bruce's voter registration card in the archives. Um, Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned Bart. He's got another close friend, Walter, who dies. Like, so the Vietnam War was real to him from the time he was a child. And he does write about the war earlier, like you mentioned, Shades of the War on Darkness. Of course, Lost in the Flood on Greetings. We have an unreleased, like handwritten song, All Man the Guns. So he attends Vietnam War moratorium events on Monmouth University, then Monmouth College's campus. So it's always kind of simmering. But I think you, Stephen, properly contextualized it in '84, with the book coming out, Born on the 4th of July and things like that. It was time to enter onto the mainstream with it in a big way.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing I read about in the book is the famous version of the river that's on the live record, Live 75 to 85, where he does the long monologue before he plays the river, where he's talking about how he was almost drafted and like how
Yeah.
his dad was initially wishing that he would get drafted because he
Yeah.
wanted to instill some discipline in Bruce. And then when he finds out that Bruce actually like wasn't drafted, and he says, that's good, and
Yeah.
they embrace. So that's another big thing I think with this. I mean, it is interesting to think about how, I mean, Bruce was like a, I feel like he was like a little ahead of the curve with the Vietnam veterans. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, again, if you think about like the 81 show that he did, because the organization that he was doing a fundraiser for, which I can't remember the exact organization off the top of my head right now, but they were a bird, they were like a struggling organization at the time, this Vietnam Veterans Organization. And Bruce did this fundraiser for them in LA. And it really was one of the things that really gave this organization another life. They were struggling to raise money. And the activism that Bruce was doing well before Born in the USA on behalf of Vietnam veterans. I mean, I think that really was a big deal for that organization at the
Yeah.
time.
Oh, the founders of the organization say it saved them. It gave them the opportunity to succeed. Here's a question from Bob. The second half of your book is about Bruce putting a distance between himself and the Born in the USA phenomenon. When they inevitably release the Born in the USA box set, should it be linked to the Nebraska sessions, as many have suggested?
So it's funny because when I've been promoting the book, this comes up all the time. The well, you say the inevitable box set. I'm starting to wonder if there is going to be a box set because, and I really want to talk to people who actually have a say in this because you look at the Born to Run box set documentary, Darkness on the Edge of Town, like a big box set, great documentary. The River had a whole tour dedicated to it, along with a box set. And now we have Nebraska. There's going to be like a biopic about Nebraska. There's obviously the Warren Zanes book about Nebraska. And then you have the biggest Bruce Springsteen album, and it feels like it's crickets. And I'm sorry, the River box set didn't come out exactly on the 35th anniversary. It came out in 2016, so there was 1 year later. So maybe there is going to be something, but I don't know if there is going to be one. I'm really curious if that's actually going to happen. And look, I wrote a whole book, armchairs, psychoanalyzing Bruce. So I guess I shouldn't stop now. I do wonder if, on some level, there's an ambivalence about this album that's different from these other records that we're talking about, and where because I wonder, like, with Bruce, because in my mind, Nebraska and Born in the USA should be part of the same package. If there were a box set, that should be a thing. It should be like a 8, 9, 10 CD or LP box set that shows the evolution of Bruce from, like, like late 81 into 84. But I don't know if Bruce himself sees these albums as linked. It doesn't seem like he does. I could be wrong about that, but I don't know. It's curious to me that there was virtually no acknowledgement of this record this year from the Springsteen camp. And it just causes the armchair psychoanalyst in me to wonder if this is an album that he's, like, still not sure about celebrating. Like, if he's not as connected to it as these other records. I don't know. It it again, like, I'd love to sit him down and talk about this myself. But um yeah, if it were me curating it, yeah, it would be one big box set. And it would be all the demos that he did for, it'd be Nebraska demos. It'd be there's a bootleg, I think it's called Fistful of Dollars. Could be misremembering that. I have this bootleg where it's like early Nebraska demos, and then it's bleeding into the Born in the USA demos, and then you have the Electric Nebraska on there, and then you have, like, outtakes from Born in the USA, and then you have, like, live tracks from the tour that haven't been released yet, and it just takes you on this journey. That's what I would do if I was in charge, but I'm not in charge. I'm not anywhere close to being in charge. So so who knows? But yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's inevitable that there's going to be a box set. I really don't. I don't know if it's going to happen. Hopefully it will. I know the record company would love it if it if he wanted to do it. I think it's only because for whatever reason he hasn't wanted to do it yet.
On the subject of Bruce's possible ambivalence about Born in the USA, Peter asks, you mentioned Bruce being ambivalent about Born in the USA, and you also talk about his journey to escape the cultural impact it created around him, culminating in the Tom Joad tour. How do you see him reckoning with the album's legacy in the reunion era?
You know, it, well, I mean, if we're talking, like, the initial reunion, in the late 90s, I mean, when he would play Born in the USA, it would be as an acoustic song, I think. Uh, it's interesting with him too, like, with when he plays the song Born in the USA. Like, when I saw him on this most recent tour, he didn't play Born in the USA. And I don't think he really did it much, or if all at all, like, in America. It feels like he plays that song more when he's in Europe, which is an interesting thing. And he'll, like, because in Road Diary, the movie that you were talking about, which I've seen, there is a clip of him playing Born in the USA in that movie, but I think it's him playing it overseas, like, not in America. And I think, again, I think that links back to maybe some fear of playing that song in America and Americans taking it the wrong way. I think it's different to play that song in Europe, because I think in Europe, obviously, they're going to understand where Bruce is coming from. Whereas in America, it's such a more loaded song to play in a stadium, where it just goes to, like, a different place that is maybe kind of gross.
Mm.
So it's fascinating, like, to see him still kind of reckoning with some of this stuff, because it does still seem like something he's dealing with in a weird way. Like, certainly with that song specifically. I mean, like, when he plays, like, Working on the Highway or something. I mean, obviously that's not the same thing, or Glory Days, or any of the other big hit songs from that. Because there were certainly a lot of Born in the USA songs in the show I saw, but, like, not the title track. It seems like he plays that more overseas than here.
Here's a question from Hart in the chat. What do you make of the recent Zach Bryan comparisons? An artist who I can see the comparisons, but seems really different to me as a political writer or his writing on American life.
Yeah, I mean, Zach Bryan on his latest record really leans into the Bruce aspects, where, I mean, he obviously has Bruce Springsteen literally show up on a song. Uh, and, Bruce went on stage with Zach. I don't know, I think it was at Barclays Center in Brooklyn when they played there. Um, and on his latest record, Zach Bryan is also writing about, he's making references to trying to think of the exact song, but there's a couple songs like where he's like writing about like things in Philadelphia and very sort of Springsteen-y type lyrical details, which didn't exist in his songs at all, really, before that. I mean, Zach Bryan is from Oklahoma. So, he's not writing about like New Jersey stuff or, like Philadelphia or whatever, East Coast type story songs. I mean, I think that really comes from Zach Bryan becoming like a stadium level performer, which for like a male singer-songwriter is you don't really see that much. So if you are reaching that level of fame, who do you emulate? Well, Bruce Springsteen is an obvious person, I think, to draw on. So it almost feels like it's been sort of like reverse engineered with
Mm-hmm.
Zach Bryan. Like I don't like because I've enjoyed Zach Bryan songs for a long time. I don't feel like his early songs necessarily are very Springsteen-esque. It really wasn't until this most recent album, I think, where he really started emulating that. I mean, not to go too deep into Zach Bryan commentary, but I kind of wish he would emulate Springsteen more because his music tends to be very sort of samey, like one guy with an acoustic guitar writing generic sounding music a lot of the time. I think he needs to get like Professor Roy Bittan on there, drop some sweet synthesizers. Maybe Max Weinberg can drop some awesome sounding drums. I think he could use some of that oomph a little bit on his records, but that's maybe for a Zach Bryan Zoom call. We can talk about that. But yeah, that's my take on that.
Well, that allows me the perfect transition to Jerry's question. I love your discussion of the technology in the making of Nebraska and Born in the USA and how the immediate aftermath of the 80s made the record feel dated. Can you talk a little bit about the resurgence of synths and the big sound that some contemporary bands have tried to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny because I was talking earlier about how I feel like among music writers or maybe Bruce Springsteen intellectuals, if I can use that term, that I feel like Born in the USA hasn't really been talked about. But among musicians, I feel like Born in the USA is one of the big records that has been a touchstone for bands in the last 20 years, whether it's, the Killers or The National or Arcade Fire or the War on Drugs. I mean, there's any number of bands where that specific era of Bruce Springsteen, where he was combining, like Fender guitars with synthesizers. That's been a big influence. Kurt Weill is another one that I could throw out there. Um, and along with Nebraska, I think is just an eternal touchdown for younger artists. I mean, Nebraska, I think, is an easier record for a lot of artists who maybe don't know anything else about Bruce Springsteen, just because it doesn't have the saxophone. It doesn't have a lot of the more bombastic aspects of Bruce Springsteen's music. It is just an intimate guy with a guitar album. So um, maybe you start with Nebraska and then you get into the other records. But yeah, I think Born in the USA um, it is fascinating with that album because, and you see this with all record. I'm always one of the things I love as a music critic as I get older is just seeing over time how the perception of music history changes because there's music history is never set in stone. It's constantly changing because you always have a younger generation coming along that will decide, oh, that's not the best record by that artist. It's actually this album. Like, oh, you guys didn't think that Tunnel of Love was a very good record. That's actually our favorite record. Or, Born in the USA, you thought that the synthesizers made that sound dated. Well, we actually love the synthesizers, and and we think it sounds more sort of modern because we're into the 80s right now in the 2010s or 2020s. Um, that's always changing. Um, but yeah, I mean, I also think that there's something sort of aspirational about Born in the USA. Like, again, you think of a band like The Killers, for instance, like when they're making Sam's Town. I think they're a band that, you know, wants to be on the biggest stage and they want to make a big impact. And they look at Bruce Springsteen in his Born in the USA tour, and it's like, or Born in the USA era, and it's like, this is something that we can emulate uh, and move and take it forward because we want to be as impactful as Bruce was in the mid 80s, even if that seems sort of impossible, 20 or 30 years later.
And I smile a little because aspiring to be as impactful as Bruce was when Bruce himself struggled with being that impactful, right? Like,
Exactly. Exactly. But, in a way, like Bruce was in an era where it wasn't that unusual for someone like him to be huge.
mm-hmm.
Whereas if you're a band in the 21st century, you look back on that and you're like, this guy's playing rock songs in a stadium and people are singing along and they're loving it and they're also sort of having their minds and their hearts moved at the same time. And it becomes the perspective changes because it feels like it feels kind of like a miracle in a way that he was able to do that 20 years later or 30 years after the fact, whatever it is. But yeah, Bruce himself maybe in the moment didn't maybe he didn't fully appreciate like what he was able to pull off with that.
It's a question from Caroline about process. I'm always curious to know about the approach writers take to processing and reckoning with something as elusive as music. Does the process of writing about music change your own relationship to the music as you write?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think because it is really hard to write about music. And one of the things I struggle with as someone who writes about music is that the miracle of music is that it doesn't have to be articulated. It's this thing that you can hear and it's totally abstract. Like the average hit song is way is totally nonlinear. It's abstract. And like if you were to just look at it on a page, like it wouldn't make any sense. And like we accept abstraction and like nonlinear storytelling in songs way more than we do in film or in TV or in books. Like we expect a film to make sense. We don't need songs to make sense. They can be just gibberish. And it's about the emotional sort of feeling that you get listening to it. So like as a writer that writes about music, I sometimes do think like, am I like ruining this by writing about it? Because the greatness of this is that it doesn't have to be explained. And to me, I guess the way I get around that is that I think people read books about music because they want to re-experience listening to a song that they love. Like, I think if you're going to buy this book, it's because you probably love Bruce Springsteen and you listen to this album a million times. But maybe you read this book and it's going to do something in your brain that will make it sound different to you, or maybe like a little fresher to you. because it's putting something in your ear that's like, oh, I didn't think about it that way. I kind of found like a different door into this album that I didn't find before. And my hope is that maybe it will add to the appreciation to the record. It'll make it more fun, or at least make it more fun to think about. So that's always my hope with this. They were asking about process. I think I got, did I miss the
I
process
think
part?
no, I think you answered the question because it's like, does the process then kill your love of the music, right?
For
When you're
me,
studying
no.
anything for so long, it can suck the joy out of it.
For me, no, because I've always loved thinking about music and you know, again, like I sort of despise over intellectualizing music, because like I read like a lot of academic writing about music sometimes, and I feel like it totally misses the spirit of a record. Like my hope whenever I write about something is that it can at least feel somewhat like listening to a record. Like because I do over intellectualize stuff, even though I kind of hate it when people do that, but like I do hope that I can do it in a way that is still in the spirit of the music. Because I think any writing about music, it should have the same sort of joy or sense of discovery that listening to music is. That to me is the definition of good writing about music. If it doesn't have that, it just feels like being at a concert and having a blowhard talking in your ear the entire time, and you just wish somebody shut this guy up, you know? Whereas I want it to be like we're hanging out, having some beers, listening to music, having a ball, and we're having a great conversation about it. Like that is my hope that people get when they read this book or anything I write. So to me, the joy always has to be there, or else, like, if it ruined it for me, I would stop writing because music is too important to me. Like, if it made me not like music, I would stop. But I think it actually makes me like music more. So I'm fortunate, I guess, in that regard.
I kept saying the book was so well written and funny, and maybe funny isn't the right word, although no, it is funny at a time, but joyful, as you just said. This is a joyful
Funny is
book.
great. I like that you
Yeah.
found it funny.
You don't sacrifice. I think the book has great like academic integrity, to wear my professor hat, but it's joyful and it's funny. And we are out of time. So I think we could probably go for 3 hours, but Steven was kind to give us one. We're going to leave everybody wanting more. You're going to go get the book and you are going to enjoy every second of reading it.
Does anyone want to go home?
no,
What?
no, right?
Uh,
Um, I actually, though, I have a homework assignment if anyone wants it, right? I told you I've been teaching for 17 years. So I have a homework assignment if anyone wants it. So hear me out. Midway through the book, Stephen ponders what if Bruce had put out an additional album in the 80s, culled from his leftover material? You even give it a title, right? You
I
title this
do.
album that should have come out in 85 or 86, Man at the Top. So, all
Yes.
you big Bruce fans out there, if Bruce had put out an album in 85 or 86, what tracks would you have put on it? Steven gives his track list in the book. So, that's another thing. Go do your homework, come up with your track list, and then compare it against Steven's in his book. All right, Steven, any final words on your part?
No, again, I'm just I want to get to this museum. It looks like it's going to be an amazing place, and I'm just really honored and thrilled that you have had me here today. So thanks for that.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. If we didn't get to your questions, I'm sorry, but it's better to leave them wanting more. So I hope that we will see you next month when we'll be talking about Springsteen on film. So you can find all of our events in person, virtual, information on donating to our 501c3, all the info you need, springsteenarchives.org. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great
Thank you,
night.
Melissa. Thank you, Steve. Good night, all.